recently. Just how big are we talking in terms of a cost increase that's going to flow through to module manufacturing, and where do you think it's headed?
Yeah, so I mean, silver prices came into 2025 in the sort of low 30s in sort of dollars per ounce terms, and then there was a steady rise for quite a lot of the year. So end of Q1 they were mid 30s, end of Q2 they're high 30s, end of Q3 they're up into sort of mid to high 40s. By the end of the year, it was sort of $80 an ounce, and we've kept going up since then.
Months have stretched into years, and there's been few signs of relief from the pain being experienced by the solar manufacturing segment. But that may be in the process of changing, although signals are, at best, mixed. Welcome to the Smarter E podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Gifford. It's been a dominant feature of the solar industry throughout the past 24 to 36 months. Fast falling and then persistently low solar wafer, cell and module prices. And while it may help with solar's competitiveness, rock bottom pricing is extremely challenging for the manufacturers themselves. And for a truly sustainable industry, sustainable pricing must be achieved for quality, for bankability, and also for ongoing technological progress and R&D. In 2026, there are a few signs that pricing may rebound, although whether that means a return to sustainable margins is far from clear. On the podcast today, I'll be joined by two analysts from UK business intelligence provider CRU or CRU to talk pricing and also technology trends within solar production. A little later, we'll also hear from Sonia Dunlop, the CEO of the Global Solar Council, which has rapidly grown in status as an international industry voice in what can sometimes be a fractious industry. A quick word of warning, I spoke to Sonia in person in London a few weeks ago, and as can sometimes be the case when you're on location, the audio isn't perfect, but Sonia's message is an important one, and she takes us through her organization's goal to expand rooftop solar households from 75 million homes today to 300 million by the end of the decade, and to do so, electricity market reform will be a major focus of the Global Solar Council. So stick around for that. But first, let's talk pricing, what to expect, and how shifting commodity trends are influencing PV technology in 2026 and beyond. After a period of exuberant manufacturing capacity expansion in China and Southeast Asia, the solar industry has settled into another long winter of super low prices right across the module supply chain. But with policy shifts in China, surging prices in some key commodities, and the constant march of technology, that may be about to change in 2026. My guests today are from business intelligence provider CRU, which has a particular expertise in the commodity sectors like metals, mining, fertilizers, and since their acquisition of Exawatt in 2023, solar PV as well. The analysts formerly known as Exawatt are Alex Barrows, the head of PV, and senior analyst Molly Morgan from CRU Economics and Sustainability. Thank you to both of you for joining the Smarter E podcast today.
Thanks very much for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan.
Well, Alex, over to you first. Trade policy always plays a big role in the PV industry. And just in January, we saw that the VAT rebate for solar modules exported from China was being reduced. Also, I believe, in batteries. How does that mechanism work, and what does it mean for pricing?
Yeah, so essentially, Chinese module makers themselves as well, they could claim back some of their input VAT costs when they exported products. That originally was at 13%, which is the standard Chinese VAT rate. In 2024, that rebate dropped to 9%. And then from April this year, it's going to drop all the way to 0. So they won't be able to claim that back anymore. So essentially, their manufacturing costs are going to go up by close to 10% for modules that are then going to be exported. So realistically, we are likely to see some higher pricing from that. Some contracts, by all accounts, have already got clauses written in there. This has been something that's been expected for a while. Lots of rumours about this being something that would change from sort of last summer or so. So some contracts have already got that written in, but I think we can expect to see prices for Chinese exported modules increase. The real question is whether manufacturers will be able to pass on all of that cost increase or not. And that's depends a lot on supply, demand, what's going on with everything else in China that I'm sure we'll get into a bit more later as well. But they're also trying to pass on other cost increases at the moment. So commodities prices have gone up recently. Silver's gone through the roof. Aluminium has gone up quite a bit recently as well. So if you're a module manufacturer and you're exporting modules, you've got quite a few overlapping cost increases that are either happening now or about to happen, and that you're going to have to try and pass on to your customers.
Yeah, I guess we are going to dig into kind of those commodity prices and right across the supply chain. But just in terms of these kind of rebates or exemptions that were in place, I've seen a bit of noise online from the module makers themselves, giving everyone a heads up. Prices are heading north. Are they trying to kind of talk up the price a little bit, do you think, or really just keeping people informed?
I think there's been a little bit of both on that. Partly it was trying to sort of drum up business as well. Get your modules now before the rebate goes up. And we may see a bit of extra demand in Q1 this year before that rebate is removed in April. But I think some of that's already happened sort of second half of last year because there were all these rumours about this. So some people have got ahead of this already in terms of getting exported modules from China. There's obviously a desire to talk up the fact that prices are going up. I think, with the rebate, with silver, with aluminium, these are all things that are going to push up prices. They're not necessarily going to mean that module manufacturers go back to profitability. So higher prices, yes. Profitable module makers, I'm slightly less convinced in the near future.
Yeah, so it is a kind of price trend heading in the different direction to what we've seen over the past couple of years, but it doesn't necessarily mean relief for the module makers themselves. Now, you mentioned the silver price. I guess that's the kind of headline price increase or commodity increase that we've seen most recently. Just how big are we talking in terms of a cost increase that's going to flow through to module manufacturing, and where do you think it's headed?
Yeah, so silver prices came into 2025 in the sort of low 30s in sort of dollars per ounce terms, and then there was a steady rise for quite a lot of the year. So end of Q1 they were mid 30s, end of Q2 they're high 30s, end of Q3 they're up into sort of mid to high 40s. By the end of the year it was sort of $80 an ounce. And we've kept going up since then. So we're sort of around the 100 mark now. As a rule of thumb, each sort of $10 an ounce is about 0.25, 0.3 cents per watt, in US cents, that is. So just over Q4 last year, where we went from kind of 40 up to $80 an ounce, that's sort of slightly over 1 cent a watt in terms of impact. And then potentially another half a cent per watt just in the last few weeks in terms of what's happened with silver prices. So it's a pretty big impact, especially if you look at that in the context of cell price rather than module price as well. Proportionally, it's a big shift. The cell manufacturers have been able to pass through a lot of that cost increase. If you look at cell spot prices, those have ramped up a lot over the last few weeks. Module makers seem to be finding it a little bit harder to pass that through at the moment. But silver has gone pretty nuts. There was a long time where it was sort of fluctuating in the $20 to $30 an ounce range, and $5 an ounce difference was significant. And then we've suddenly gone, more than doubled over the last 3 and a bit months.
Well, I recall that, some of the biggest progress that's been made in PV technology in terms of its cost profile over the last kind of decade, this modern solar industry period has been this reduction in silver usage, right? And it's all come through like screen printing, which is a pretty kind of basic or primitive technology, which is perhaps its virtue as well, right? It's not overly complicated and can just be done. And be repeated and incrementally improved, thinner lines, taller lines, less silver. What can be done from a technological standpoint, or what impact will this higher silver price, do you believe, have on solar technology?
Yes, I mean, it's an interesting one thinking about how this would have been had it happened 10 years ago as well, when silver usage was much higher. There was a period where silver price increases like we've seen sort of could have stopped the industry in its tracks almost. That's not necessarily true anymore because so little silver is used. Modules are a relatively small part of system cost now as well. But I mean, going forward, I think this will help to push manufacturers away from silver. That's something that they have been wanting to do for quite some time, or been interested in for quite some time anyway. You talk to manufacturers the last few years, there's been this sort of general interest in lining things up. This sort of general view that at some point the industry would need to move away from silver as silver prices would potentially rise. What's happened with silver recently is partly short-term things like tariff-related issues that have meant sort of physical movement of the metals around worldwide that's caused some strange shortages, and we've got sort of geopolitical tensions and the possibility of a market crash and things like that have changed the dynamics with silver. But there have long been sort of view that there's sort of supportive underlying fundamentals for silver prices gradually trending upwards. So supply has peaked of silver, at least for the medium term. The market is likely to be in deficit. People have seen this coming and have known that the industry would potentially need to move away from silver, especially as we grow towards a terawatt a year. Some people hoping we're even going to do 2 or 3 terawatts a year. So manufacturers have had this sort of on their to-do list, but I think this just moves it very much to the top of that list rather than being something that we know needs to happen at some point, but there's not a big rush just yet. We can take our time. Maybe it's copper plating, maybe it's printing copper pastes, for example. Now I think there's a lot more of an impetus for manufacturers to make that jump. I'm not sure it necessarily changes anything in terms of which cell technologies we're going to see take the biggest market share. So, TOPCon uses more silver than PERC does, but I don't see this being something that makes us go backwards in terms of going back to PERC in a significant way. The efficiency gap is just so big now, with TOPCon being so much more efficient than PERC. And similarly with HJT, I mean, actually HJT kind of has an advantage now because it uses much more paste than TOPCon, but the low temperature processes mean you can use silver copper sort of combination paste. So if you look at HJT that might use, say, 30% silver or 40% silver in the paste, that's using less silver per watt than TOPCon is. But even with the silver price changes that we've seen recently, we don't think this suddenly means that HJT is back in the game in a major way. TOPCon will stay mainstream. And then back contact uses, TOPCon back contact that we're seeing from people like ICO and LONGi, that uses more silver than standard TOPCon. But those guys are also a bit further ahead with replacing silver. So Maxion have had silver-free back contact cells for a long time. ICO have had a silver-free option available for a while. LONGi have talked about sort of mass production of sort of base metal, sort of probably copper-based cells this year. So I don't think this fundamentally changes our view of what technologies are going to dominate in the near future and how that's going to look. It just moves everyone more rapidly towards probably a copper-based alternative. It'll be interesting to see how quickly people can apply that and how long this silver price rally lasts for. So CRU has a precious metals team, and talking to the silver analyst the other week, they are pretty bullish on silver prices staying high. I think their phrase was, there's more upside than downside over the next 6 months for silver. So we're probably not going to drop back down to $40, $50 an ounce, next week, which means there is going to be, at least probably first half of this year, there's going to be pretty sustained pressure on cell and module makers to put a lot more effort into replacing silver.
Well, and you mentioned kind of silver copper paste combined, right? As I understand it, that's kind of a copper coated with silver, or some kind of it's a hybrid like that, isn't it?
Yeah. And it works well on HJT because it's a low temperature process. To do it with the sort of firing temperatures that you would use on TOPCon, I've not seen anyone do that.
Okay, right.
I'm not
so
sure whether that's viable.
TOPCon. Yeah, whether you can do it at high temperature.
Yeah. I think the firing temperature sort of destroys that structure. You've got the sort of copper within the silver, and the high firing temperatures in TOPCon and back contact sort of destroy that structure to some extent.
Yeah, cool. Well, let's dig into back contact in a bit more detail just very shortly. But Molly, I want to bring you into the conversation and let's talk about performance, right? Because the silver price is key when it comes to technology and from a cost standpoint. But of course, performance is always key. Efficiency you then look at a system level balance of system, that's another key driver of solar's competitiveness. Now at Crew, I know that you're involved in collating the data about on the performance side in terms of modules. What trends are we seeing in terms of performance? I suppose there's those key groups, PERC, which we know very well. We then have TOPCon, back contact TOPCon, heterojunction, and even kind of a back contact heterojunction, as I understand it. So how are things kind of playing out in terms of performance?
Yeah. So firstly, you're absolutely right. That's one of the things that we cover at Crew. We have this quarterly tracking piece of work that we do, so we get to dive into who's producing what efficiencies, and what are the performances of these technologies. And it's definitely safe to say that even though market conditions have been tough for manufacturers in 2025 and even 2024, that really doesn't mean that performance and innovation has halted. And we've seen performance and efficiencies continue to increase and continue to improve. And taking TOPCon as an example, as the mainstream technology of today, at the end of 2024, max efficiency was around the 23.4% mark. And then in the space of a year, that's improved up to around 24.8%. And that was led by impressive improvements by Jinko Solar, so much so that their Tiger 3 data sheets still lead our data set today in terms of performance and in terms of efficiencies. And there's been not just one innovation that's been able to strive for those higher and higher efficiencies. There's been a range of things like TOPCon specific innovations and also more architectural improvements as well.
And then when we turn to kind of some of the, heterojunction and TOPCon have been kind of neck and neck for some time, generally with the understanding that heterojunction comes at a cost premium in terms of production, as Alex was saying, silver being one of the key ones. But then heterojunction has some kind of other performance attributes or qualities, like enhanced kind of bifaciality. Also, the temperature coefficient can be superior to TOPCon, but from what I understand, that kind of gap is narrowing or may have even disappeared completely.
Yeah, so with efficiency alone, you are completely correct that we do see the benefits of heterojunction with the bifaciality factors and the improved temperature coefficients. And that's something that heterojunctions managed to really keep hold of that benefit from on those two parameters. With efficiencies, it's something that we've observed over the past couple of years, almost like a neck and neck scenario where you'll have an improvement in TOPCon efficiency one quarter, and then the next quarter there might be a manufacturer's released a beneficial heterojunction data sheet. So it's really been a constant competition between the two technologies in terms of max efficiency, but then considering that heterojunction does come with this higher manufacturing cost, like you said, that's sort of what's inhibiting heterojunction's ability to take any of that market share away from TOPCon. Whereas when you consider back contact, and we've got an extract from the latest module tracker report to share with you all, you can see how back contact has those beneficial efficiencies over TOPCon, whereas heterojunction at the moment, or at least in the Q1 2026 edition of the report, is lagging slightly behind TOPCon in terms of those max efficiencies. So it's those efficiency gains of back contact combined with being able to achieve cost parity in the sort of 2028 timeframe that's the logic behind why we think that, or perhaps why we're quite bullish on the fact that back contact will be able to rival, compete, or at least coexist with TOPCon in the sort of 2028 to the 2030 timeframe.
But this could also, like it's a TOPCon back contact that you're talking about, competing with TOPCon screen printed. Yeah. Okay. So about 2028 is the crew expectation for back contact to kind of reach that parity.
Yeah, that's when, from the outputs of our bottom-up cost model combined with our efficiency forecast by technology, that's the point at which we think is the earliest that back contact can achieve this cost parity. And therefore, that's sort of the tipping point for the technology to be able to have at least some form of technology transition. Like I just mentioned, it's somewhat unclear whether this might be like a wide-scale transition or how gradual or how rapid it will be. And that will really hinge on just whether or not back contact can achieve and sustain sort of a 1% efficiency delta over TOPCon. And if that's achieved, which we think it may be able to be achieved, then that's when we think that tipping point is for the market shares to tip in back contact's favour. But again, that's hinging on whether or not those efficiency deltas can be sustained. And given that at the end of 2025, we saw lots of innovations in TOPCon and TOPCon unlocking efficiencies that exceeded our efficiency forecast in the short term, at least, that's what back contact has to compete against. And if the technology can't sustain that premium, that's going to inhibit back contact's market shares reaching sort of the 50% mark by the end of the decade.
Yeah, that's what we've always got to keep in mind, right? That it's the technologies are always a moving target, really, until they reach their absolute pinnacle, which kind of was achieved with mono-PERC, and then there's nowhere else to go. I also realized that I should probably, for the people who are slightly less solar tech geeky as us, explain, like, bifaciality heterojunction has that very symmetrical cell, so that's why they get better efficiencies on the rear side. Temperature coefficient, that just means that power output at higher temperatures is better, so the efficiency doesn't drop off, and they're kind of some of the virtues of heterojunction. But when we were talking about heterojunction costs, and Alex, you'll particularly have insight into this. It's not only silver, and it's not only the production processes, but it's also the capex, so the capital cost of the production equipment that puts heterojunction at a higher cost profile. Is that right?
Yeah, so HJT capex is higher, and there's some other things in there as well. So heterojunction, typically on the front and the back, you will have what's called a transparent conductive oxide. So normally that's indium tin oxide as a thin layer. That is relatively expensive as well. So you've got that on the front and back of HJT devices, and that adds to the cost in a meaningful way as well.
Yep. Okay. And turning back to silver, right? This is where we kind of started our conversation about these commodity prices. Let's dig a little bit more deeply into silver consumption per technology, because I think what is fascinating is that, as you said, there is the potential for these silver-free back contact technologies. There's also the potential for silver reduction through kind of these hybrid pastes, and also silver-free production with a kind of plating technology. Just talk us through consumption now and where you see the potential for silver replacement if the price continues to head up, which it seems like the crew commodity experts are saying, at least it's not going to decline. It appears like it might not decline.
Yeah, so I guess I should say in the long run, it probably will decline. Okay. Silver has probably overstretched the position where it is now. But certainly the next 6 months or so, the outlook is prices remaining high. It's likely that at some point there will be a pullback in pricing. So you may want to think twice before investing your entire pension into the silver market. But it won't drop back to. It's unlikely to drop back to where it was. It's going to likely to remain elevated. From where we were when we came into this period of very rapid price rises. So sort of certainly the next 6 months or so, I think we're quite likely to see high prices, and then it may drop back second half of this year or maybe early 27. But it probably won't go all the way back down to where it was. So we probably are now in a world of elevated cell metallization costs going forward, and it's just a question of how elevated they are. And so PERC, if you think about silver usage for different technologies, we've got a chart so that anyone watching this can see. But PERC, you're looking at something in the region of, say, 7 milligrams per watt. TOPCon's a bit higher, sort of 8 to 9 milligrams per watt range. Back contact a bit higher again, up closer to something like 11. And then HJT, if you were using a pure silver paste, it would be up more like 15 milligrams per watt. But if you're using a paste that's only sort of 30% silver, then you're getting down towards the 4 milligrams per watt range. So really very low if you use one of those silver copper pastes that has quite a low silver content. And so obviously those differences will feed through to metallization costs. But essentially, metallization costs have gone up for everything. And I think manufacturers now will be looking much more at copper plating solutions and also sort of copper printing solutions. There's been lots of people the last few years working on copper paste solutions, essentially, so you wouldn't necessarily have to move away from screen printing. One of the problems with plating is that the capex is high. Screen printing is very, very simple, well understood, low capex process. Plating is higher capex, it's more complex. There's more other chemicals involved. There's more waste treatment and disposal challenges involved. So if you could have a copper printing solution, for example, rather than a copper plating solution, and if you could demonstrate the required stability on that, because you have to be careful when it comes to sort of copper in solar cells. You don't want it getting, copper where it shouldn't be can destroy a solar cell quite easily. one of the other, I guess, one of the other advantages for HJT in terms of this sort of silver copper paste combo is that they have that layer of ITO on that we were talking about as well, that can act as a bit of a barrier layer. So there's lots of overlapping things from the different technologies in terms of usage, in terms of how easy it might be to apply copper on them. But I think for all technologies now in this new world where metallization costs are likely to stay at least somewhat elevated, we will see more and more move away from silver over the next few years.
And in fact, copper metallization and copper plating is much more widespread in, the consumer electronics industry. It's rather that kind of solar is a bit of an outlier in that it still uses silver, right?
Yeah, it's not that you can't do copper plating. It has been done. It's just that previously it hasn't been worthwhile making that shift. If silver stays at $100 an ounce and in a few months everyone is expecting that to be the new normal forever going forward, I'm sure we'll see some very rapid transition. Copper plating is going to look very attractive with silver at $100 an ounce.
Yeah, previously it was too hard, too messy. Why bother? And necessity is the mother of invention, right? With a high price.
Yeah, there's a crossover point in terms of when it becomes worth it, both for the sort of process challenges and the costs involved in switching to plating. In a world of $100 an ounce silver, I think we are past that point. So then the question is, when might we drop back if prices are high for the first half of this year? Do they drop back in the second half? Does that make it take a little bit of the pressure off? And how quickly can you apply these things? Applying these things across hundreds of gigawatts of production isn't something that you can do overnight if all your engineers on your cell lines are trained on screen printing silver, and you say, even moving to screen printing of copper is going to have changes there, let alone moving to rapid move towards something like plating. That's a lot of engineers and operators, just at a logistical level. Even if you decide, at a high level, if the board decides, the technology team decides this is a sensible thing to do, just doing that over hundreds of gigawatts would take some time anyway.
Yeah, that does make sense. Now, Molly, we were talking about this kind of transition to back contact technology potentially on the cards in 2028, according to the Crew kind of bottom-up cost model, I think is how you described it. In terms of the manufacturing landscape at the moment, Maxion, as Alex said, with its heritage in sun power, really the pioneer of back contact technology going back, I think, to the 90s. Dick Swanson and his team there. Where do we kind of stand today in terms of mainstream back contact technology? You mentioned ICO. What could this kind of transition look like in terms of brands and manufacturers?
Yeah, so today, back contact, although it's got some really good modules out there on the market, it still does remain a niche technology, and that's even despite, like, you might walk around trade shows recently in 2025 and you'll see manufacturers with back contact modules at their booths and on display, but they're not quite commercially available yet. Like, they're more sort of prototypes, but we are seeing more and more talk of back contact, more and more sort of pilot lines and manufacturers laying the groundwork. But then today it's still niche with only a handful of manufacturers that are actually manufacturing at scale or have those products ready to buy and commercially available. And so today the manufacturers that are sort of dominating the back contact scene in terms of scale and production volumes, it largely lies within ICO and Longi. But like I say, that's not to say there are lots of manufacturers sort of almost ready to pounce, where they've got the pilot lines and they're waiting for the opportune moment to make that switch and make that transition when it makes sense financially for them. So that's it it could be a rapid transition in 2028, like we've seen in the past with other transitions, like from monoperk to TOPCon, because we believe that a lot of manufacturers, they've done their homework and they're ready and they're waiting. But then the caveat to that is the transition from perk to TOPCon was perhaps a lot easier for manufacturers, with equipment being more readily and easy to upgrade, whereas not quite as easy with this transition.
Yeah, it's more of a step change than just an evolution. Or I think with that kind of perk TOPCon transition, it was kind of putting equipment into existing lines. It wasn't kind of changing the whole back end of your line or the whole metallization part of your line.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's look to pricing. And one of the things that kind of back contact manufacturers are able to do at the moment, you see it out on the trade show floor. ICO modules, Maxeon modules they're quite clearly differentiated. And that potentially allows them to get a bit of a cost premium or avoid that kind of race to the bottom pricing, which is so often a feature in PV. Now, we've talked about commodity prices coming up. Are we entering a kind of a new cycle in terms of pricing when it comes to PV cells, modules, or across the supply chain? Alex, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah.
Well, he probably doesn't want to have a go at that one, but we'll have a go anyway.
Is it a new cycle? Well, so we're definitely entering a period where there's a lot of upwards pressure from those input price rises. So silver getting more expensive, that's feeding through to cell prices, where people are buying cells externally, and it's feeding through to the integrated manufacturers in terms of their cost stack. We've seen poly prices go back up again, sort of second half last year, pushing back up above poly manufacturing costs. And then we've got the VAT rebate change coming as well. So price rises for modules, yes. A general price rise that's not driven by those input costs, I think is trickier to say at the minute. Second half of last year, we saw poly prices go up. The whole industry had been losing money for quite some time. And then there's all this talk of sort of anti-involution in China, self-discipline agreements, manufacturers restricting production volumes, Chinese government sort of pushing back on everyone selling below cost and saying, look, you shouldn't be selling below cost. And poly was really interesting because the poly makers managed to push prices back up despite the sort of market fundamentals not being there to support that. Like poly inventory, really big. There's huge poly inventory. There's huge amounts of overcapacity. Not just 50% too much, but like 3-4 times more poly capacity than the world needs. And yet poly prices pushed back above production costs, and they held there for the sort of basically the second half of last year and going into the start of this year. But the rest of the industry didn't quite manage to do that. So wafer cell module makers mostly still losing money, at least in most markets. I mean, there's money to be made selling into the US, for example. But your modules being sold in China, in APAC, in Europe, etc. Most people losing money. And then the start of this year, we've had reports of Chinese government agencies pushing back against some of this sort of coordination and consolidation plans in poly. So the polysilicon manufacturers had set up this company that was essentially going to act as a platform for acquiring and shutting down some old capacity. I mean, that wasn't going to get rid of overcapacity. It was just going to get rid of a little bit on the top. There's still going to be way more than everyone needed. But it might have helped make it easier to coordinate on production volumes, easier to coordinate on pricing, that kind of thing. And then we see some of the sort of government agencies pushing back on this, saying, you guys shouldn't be coordinating on prices, you shouldn't be coordinating on production volumes, watch out, you might be breaking anti-monopoly laws here, that kind of thing. We've not really seen yet what the impact of that will be, and I think that's something we'll see a lot more of over the next month or two. Does that really get in the way of this kind of coordination? Because coordination on whether it's on production volumes or on everyone agreeing that they don't sell below cost or whatever it is, that's the only way out of the current, where we are in the current cycle. There is no sign that demand is going to catch up to capacity in the near future. So some kind of discipline on pricing, discipline on production volumes is needed. Is that now going to get much harder to coordinate if the Chinese government is pushing back? Or is this one Chinese regulator sort of pushing back, but other parts of the government maybe won't push back in the same way? That we don't know yet. So, and that is, I guess, what will determine, not whether prices go up because of a tax change or whether prices go up because of silver prices, but that will determine sort of fundamentally, do we get out of this cycle when, manufacturers are mostly losing money? Do we return to a world where production, we're making solar wafers, cells and modules is profitable again? The fundamentals aren't there in terms of supply and demand matching up, so it depends on some level of coordination or some level of push from the Chinese government. And at the moment, we're seeing this sort of contradiction of, Chinese government, say, pushing, don't sell below cost, but then when people coordinate on pricing and volumes, saying, actually, watch out, you're coordinating on pricing and volumes. So it's clear as mud, I would say, on whether we're going to get to the end of that cycle in the near future. I would say we are less optimistic. Certainly the news about this sort of pushback on that polysilicon coordination and that platform company, I would say is a negative point from that. So we are, although I'm expecting price rises in the near future because of these input costs and the tax changes, but I think widespread return to profitability in 2026 looks less likely now.
The weird and wonderful world of PV pricing and manufacturing. Well, it's a mixed outlook. I think that's pretty clear to say. Thank you very much for providing that outlook. Alex Barrows is the head of PV, and Molly Morgan is a senior analyst at Crew Economics and Sustainability. Thank you very much, both of you, for sharing your insights on the Smartery podcast.
Thanks very much for having us.
Thank you.
Well, in just a moment, we'll hear from the CEO of the Global Solar Council, Sonia Dunlop, on the Smartery podcast. Sonia Dunlop, the CEO of the Global Solar Council, an organization which really, since 2024, has really grown very quickly in terms of prominence, in terms of membership, in terms of advocacy for the industry. Moving into the new year, what do you expect from 2026 in terms of continuing to expand and continuing to serve the industry?
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, so I mean, for us, the big thing that we just did just before Christmas in the autumn of last year is really expanding from not just being a solar PV industry association for the global industry, but also battery storage, right? So we're going to be consolidating on that and pushing forward with that and really looking at what we can do in order to support battery storage deployment as a sister technology to solar PV. So that's the first thing. Second of all, obviously constantly looking at what are the challenges, what are the barriers to deployment around the world that we need to be addressing at the global level. So that's in terms of finance barriers, in terms of grid integration and grid congestion barriers, in terms of supply chain issues. And then finally, we have a problem in terms of skills and global standardization in terms of health and safety and technical training that we're looking to solve. And for us, the big thing that's happening this year is that we're really going to be launching our big campaign, our big mission, our big initiative to get from 75 million solar and battery storage homes, which is where we think we are today, to 300 million by the end of this decade, because we really see residential rooftop solar and battery storage as the way of winning hearts and minds all over the world, winning political support, winning high-level government support for our transformational technology.
And is that really a priority because of distributed solar's kind of the way it interfaces with the consumer, right? You have a lot of households who have solar, who experience it, who have the app, see the power of the technology and also its efficacy in terms of reducing their costs. And then they'll go and advocate, I suppose, with their neighbours, with their friends and with their members of parliament.
Yeah, it's partly that, right? This is the part of the overall electrotech and renewables and energy transition that brings tangible benefits to real working families, real people all over the world, that brings down their energy bills, that gives them resilience to climate impacts, to natural disasters, to any kind of economic shock, and really helps them take control of their energy, right? And it's also the part of deployment of the industry that has the ability to scale so fast. I mean, if you look at what's happened in Pakistan over the last year and a half, where they have gone literally from 0 to 20% of the country's electricity supply being delivered by residential rooftop solar, where I think about 1 in 5 people now have solar on the roof of their home and battery storage in their front room. You know, it is just amazing the potential we have to scale, and the speed at which we can do it is incredible. And this is also the part of the solar and storage industry, indeed the part of renewables more widely, that has the potential to really win political support at ministerial level, at heads of government level, and really deliver everything that we're trying to achieve more widely to something that is tangible for regular citizens and voters and people around the world.
Well, what do you see then as being the policy headwinds for the global industry and I suppose in key markets as well?
Yeah, so for me, the number one policy headwind is actually the question of grid integration and electricity market design reform, right? Electricity markets were designed in the 50s and 60s for very outdated technologies. And now we need to change the rules of electricity markets and how they work in order for them to be able to fit better with the solution that solar and storage can provide at utility scale and at distributed scale, and to open up the different both wholesale and retail markets, but also the grid support markets, the ancillary services that provide frequency support, voltage support, reactive power, black start, open up those markets to solar plus storage, large and small, so that we can then be stacking those revenues and building the business cases for these projects in every single country around the world. And indeed, a big priority for us as the Global Solar Council this year is also really building up the capacity, the influence, the power of our national and regional associations in every country around the world. There are 190 countries around the world, 190 political capitals, and we want every single one of those to have a super strong, super influential, super successful solar and battery storage industry doing the work at national level to open up that market and making sure they're ready for the solar revolution that is to come.
Well, how challenging is it then working with such disparate associations? Because even within associations, we can see there's tension between manufacturers and developers. There's competing interests, sometimes even within the country. How difficult is it bringing together these very disparate association groups?
Look, this is our job, and we focus on the thing that brings everyone together, which is deployment. We all want to maximize deployment. We all want to maximize the number of gigawatts and terawatts on the system, and that is why we have set that in our new Global Solar Council strategy that our North Star, our primary aim, is to get to 8 terawatts of total installed capacity of solar PV by the end of the decade and 1.5 terawatts of storage. Right, and these are in line with the overall sort of goals that have been set at political level worldwide, and there's a huge scale up from where we are today. right? And so that's our plan, and everything we do comes from that. And our job is to unite the entire value chain, the manufacturers, the project developers, the EPCs, the service providers, the investors, the technical due diligence firms, the recycling firms, something that is just starting, but definitely to come, to unite all of them under one global umbrella, unite every single country around the world, and we do have national associations now in all major markets. We represent 97% of the global solar PV market, and companies from all over the world as well, and bring them all together in one united voice at global level, so that when we go to the World Bank, when we go to the World Trade Organization, when we go to the Munich Security Conference, we are one industry with one voice and one message.
Okay, well, we're here in London, which is really one of the financial capitals of Europe and also globally. In terms of attracting the capital that is required for this huge deployment volume that you're targeting, terawatts, it really is exponential growth. How challenging do you see that being, or is solar and energy storage continuing to attract the interest from the financial community, from financiers, and also these kind of multilateral financial institutions as well?
Yeah, look, the global capital markets are pouring money into our technology, right? So broadly speaking, we're seeing about just over $500 billion a year going into solar and battery storage, and that is set to just grow and grow and grow. We reckon that if you exclude China for a moment, which is its own ecosystem, about 2/3, this is anecdotal evidence, but about 2/3 of that money is either coming through London as a financial centre or coming from London as a financial centre. And that is part of why we as the Global Solar Council have decided to put our new global headquarters right here in the City of London in order to be able to shape those decisions and help them start to be even bolder in terms of where they go in the world. Because there's no doubt that if you look at where the investment is going in terms of solar and storage, and indeed renewables around the world, about 80% of it is going to the global north, to OECD countries, to Western, to the global north, and not enough is going to the global south, if you exclude China for a second. And we need to change that, right? That we have to make sure that no one is left behind in the real transformation of the energy system that we are engendering. We need to make sure that no country is left behind and no human or household is left behind, right? Everyone needs to be able to either put solar on their roof, to hang it outside their window or off their balcony, as they're doing in Germany, or to buy solar electricity from the grid produced by utility scale. And we need to make sure that this doesn't just become a lopsided transition. And that's part of what we do as the Global Solar Council by bringing everyone together.
We want to see more stories like Pakistan going forward.
We do. And the question on the tip of everyone's tongue is, which country is the next Pakistan? Is it Nigeria? Is it Turkey? Is it Indonesia, who've just set a 100 gigawatt target? Who's going to be the next Pakistan? We know that half of the solar panels that are leaving Chinese ports are now going to the global south. There are loads of countries that have the potential to scale up massively given the right conditions, and we just have to do the work with our national and regional industry associations to put those enabling conditions in place, which in Pakistan was essentially they took away subsidies to electricity prices. Diesel prices were also very high, so diesel generators weren't an alternative, and they didn't have any import duties on solar, right? Those three things, or battery storage, those three things put together lead to a huge solar boom, a solar surge in Pakistan, and we want to see that replicated in every country around the world.
And looking towards deployment, we've seen Europe, Western Europe in particular, is perhaps a little bit flat or stagnating in terms of deployments. The US have considerable political headwinds, although the energy market looks quite attractive with growing demand. What are you anticipating for 2026 on a global level? I know it's a hard thing when you're looking at so many disparate markets, but what is the general mood? Is it still continued optimism, or are these headwinds serious?
The general mood is incredibly bullish and very optimistic, right? If you look at it from a global perspective, the deployment, the growth in deployment that we are forecasting as the Global Solar Council in both PV and battery storage really is exponential. You mentioned the European market, which is of course in many ways where things started back in the late 1990s. Yes, it's slowing down slightly. The markets are maturing. They're reaching, some of them have got quite high percentages of solar electricity being injected into them. That brings me back to that point about electricity market design, about grid integration, about being smarter, about how we manage the electricity system. And critically, and here we really are at the frontier of how to run an electricity grid, but critically, can we use PV plus grid forming inverters, advanced grid supporting inverters to provide the grid stabilizing services that have traditionally always been provided by thermal power plants with spinning machinery, right? And that's the experimentation that's happening in the UK, in Australia, in California, in Germany, not enough in Spain, but I think Spain will get their skates on now. And that's what's really exciting, and that's what's going to allow us to go even further in the next years. The US market, look, of course the US market has political problems, but the fundamental economics of individual projects, both solar and battery storage, are still very good in the US. The US Solar Industry Association is very optimistic, is really also day in, day out showing how solar and storage are the technology that can deliver the kind of scaling up of power supply that is needed for the big surge in data centers for AI. No one else can do it faster. We are the ones that can deliver on time and on budget, and that is the message to get across.
Yeah, the technology will always be powerful. That's what has delivered solar's cost reductions, and now technology in terms of grid forming inverters, battery energy storage, and then the underlying economics, right? We still have a very strong business case in solar and batteries right around the world.
We do. And of course, we shouldn't ignore the fact that in China, where most manufacturers are based, of course, we're in a bit of a crisis in the sense that the manufacturers are reporting huge financial losses, right? I heard, I can't remember the exact figure, but I heard that they'd lost like $1.5 billion in the last year or something like that. And so we have an industry in crisis, a manufacturing industry in crisis. That is due to a phenomenon of over-competition, of involution within our own industry. In China, they refer to it as the cold winter. I'm sure it sounds better in Chinese. And there is a lot of work being done to try and address the overcapacity at the different levels of the supply chain, address the over-competition, because, we're in a situation where no one is winning and everyone is losing. And the irony is that just as so many governments around the world want to attract more solar and battery storage manufacturing to their shores, we also then have to deliver the very difficult message of, but do you realize this is loss-making at the moment and also doesn't bring any jobs, right? There are no jobs in manufacturing of solar and battery storage. Well, a couple per factory, but not many. The jobs are all in installation. It takes a pair of human hands to install every single solar panel, whether it be on a roof or in a massive ground-mounted solar farm. And that is where the jobs are. And we are an incredibly jobs-rich technology, but that is all downstream. The value is all downstream. And there, of course, in terms of project development, Europe is the undisputed leader worldwide, with all the big leading utility scale project developers largely being European utilities, with a couple of European oil and gas companies thrown in as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of jobs in, and also the services sector, service providers to the industry. A good message. Thank you very much, Sonia Dunlop, the CEO of the Global Solar Council. Good luck for 2026.
Thank you.